Hey guys, finally we're at the last part of Key Concept 4.1, and this is going to focus on the European Union, nationalism in Europe, and some other issues, as well as the decolonization that took place after the Second World War. In response to the destructive impact of two world wars, European nations began to set aside nationalism in favor of economic and political integration, forming a series of transnational unions that grew in size and scope over the second half of the 20th century. So, let's get started. At the end of World War II, there was a Council of Europe that was created that, many hoped would evolve into a European Parliament with sovereign rights. Of course, this didn't happen, and but economically, Europe has really been, it has been the European Union has been most successfully regarding economics and the development of the European Union, which is what we're going to first talk about. So the key concepts, the first one that you do need to know is the ECSC. And in was created began to be created in 1950 by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, and the idea was that you know it would bind these nations, particularly France and West Germany, so closely together economically that war among them would become impossible. And so the ECSC was formed. It was basically a union of coal and steel resources between the three countries of Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, France, West Germany, and Italy. And ultimately, it's going to continue to evolve throughout the 1950s. And in 1957, the European Economic Community, EEC, later on just known as the European Community or EC, and more popularly called the Common Market, will be formed. And this was signed by the same six nations in the ECSC. And the first goal of the treaty was the gradual reduction of all tariffs among those six nations to create a single market, one that could compete with the United States. They also had other goals: free movement of labor and capital across border, common economic policies and institutions, and ultimately regional specialization. And it encouraged hopes for a political and economic union. But these hopes were really kind of shattered throughout the 60s, 70s. France stepped back from European unity. Its bitter war with Algeria actually resulted in the election of Charles de Gaulle and the establishment of the Fifth French Republic. And de Gaulle actually withdrew France from NATO and developed France's own nuclear programs. Yet, despite this, we are going to see the European Union continue to grow. Interestingly, de Gaulle actually vetoed applications of Britain because Britain was seen as too pro-American in its special relationship with the United States. And so Britain did not enter the common market until 1973. And I think, as you know, right now, Britain is currently about to exit from the European Union. And so we'll see that. And today it is called the European Union. That term went into effect around 1992. Part of that, we're going to see increasing political and economic integration. And, ultimately, some of the goals was to create a foreign currency and so forth. And so we're going to see EU faced and continue to face today. In the 1990s, the Maastricht Treaty was signed that led to the creation of the euro. And this was the most radical revision of the European Union since its beginning. And by 2002, the euro became the single currency of 11 of the nations. Britain was one of the nations that did not accept the euro. And in addition, though, the Maastricht Treaty also provided for free movement across borders. Another very controversial one, especially today with the number of refugees that are coming into Europe from the Syrian civil war. It included proposals for free movement to form common foreign and defense policies, and the idea of a European Parliament that was directly elected body of the EU based on universal suffrage that meets in Brussels, Belgium, and in France. The EU will continue to grow throughout the 1990s and 2000s. By 1995, there were 15 members, and by 2005, they added two new countries, including former satellite nations, as well as parts of the former Soviet Union, such as Lithuania, maybe not Lithuania, I'm sorry, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. and it continues to grow. However, there have been also some increasing challenges because of increasing nationalism throughout the continent. Um, for example, some of the laws of the European Union are, a good example that I always give, political control. In order to join the European Union, a country cannot practice or use the death penalty. And so although most Europeans are opposed to the death penalty, many people see that as an infringement upon the sovereignty of their nation. And that has really been a challenge to the EU. When does the nation come first? And as we know, just in the past year or so, with the idea of Brexit, Britain officially voting to withdraw from the European Union. Uh, Most recently, just this past week, one of the two parties that won the election, Marine Le Pen in France, is also considering very opposed to the European Union. And so we're seeing this rise of populism today and the increased nationalism. And this directly challenges the European Union because the European Union challenges the sovereignty, both political and economic sovereignty of the nations. Another major issue that Europe has faced really since World War II, and it's really revived again, especially around the 1990s, is the idea of nationalist and separatist movement, along with ethnic conflict and cleansing, which is going to disrupt this peace. And so, talk first about nationalist violence in Ireland and Chechnya. Um, the IRA was formed many, many years ago, and the IRA wanted to basically unite all of Ireland. The northern part of Ireland is kind of a mix of Protestants and Catholics and is part of the United Kingdom, while Southern Ireland is independent. And so for many years, the IRA used terrorist type methods against the British. It was said that London was the most photographed city in the world, most videoed, because of the IRA. And we will see, although the IRA will renounce terrorism in either the late 1990s or early 2000s, we do continue to see offshoots of it, as well as the idea that existed that terrorism and violence can lead to Irish unification. We've also seen a lot of this violence in Chechnya. And so I want to talk a little bit about Chechnya. This was one of the biggest issues in Russia during the 1990s and early 2000s. And basically it started with, in 1991, when a group of Chechen nationalists declared independence from Russia. At the time, the Russian President Boris Yeltsin ordered a full-scale invasion by late 1994, and over 10,000 Chechen and 4,000 Russians died until a peace agreement was achieved. A second war began in 1999 when radical Islamists began a campaign of terror and violence that continued really through the 2000s as well. And Putin was able to kind of stabilize, crack down on the Chechen rebels after he came to office, but still we see this Chechen conflict, once again a symbol of this nationalism that is really reemerging in Europe since the breakup of the Soviet Union as well. We've also seen some separatist movements that exist, and probably the one example I can really think of is the Basque movement in Spain. And although the Basque have not been successful, this movement formed a while back, I think even prior to the Second World War, and they've not been successful in gaining it. The movement really turned to terror tactics after 1960, and they were built around this whole organization, this separatist organization called the ETA, that preferred violence. And there was a lot of even Basque nationalist groups that were opposed to the ETA, and so the ETA is very similar to the IRA in the fact that they use violence, they use terror to achieve it. As of 2017, the ETA has renounced any of its terrorist goals and supposedly has turned in its weapons, and the future is unclear. But the movement itself still continues, and there are still many in that region of Spain that do want independence. And then the issue of ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia, the Bosnian Muslims and the Albanian Muslims, instigated by the regime of Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia/Yugoslavia. And we're going to actually talk about that a little later on in more detail. Another issue that occurred in the post-World War II period was the process of decolonization. And in many respects, some of the European states were more willing, maybe it wasn't really their choice, but more willing to let go of their colonies. Others tried to hold on to them. When I look at the history of it, I think the British after World War II were, I don't know if they were more willing to let go of their colonies, they really just couldn't militarily hold on to them. The French did fight brutal wars in Indochina or Vietnam, as well as against Algeria, which we'll talk about shortly. But nationalism actually went back to the period, even prior to World War I, where many of the imperialized peoples had wanted independence. And Wilson's national self-determination, that idea that people can choose their own countries, was very appealing. In fact, it gave, you know, expectations in the non-European world that ultimately led to international instability. The fact that several nations thought they were going to gain independence and did not. One such example of that would be the countries of the Middle East. What happened with the Eastern countries was that they became what we call mandates instead, which I think is just a fancy word for colonies. But the mandate system was set up by the League of Nations, and basically a European nation would assist, France or Britain would assist a country towards independence. So if you look at the map, Syria was a French mandate, Lebanon was a French mandate, Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq were British mandates. And so the idea of the mandate system was that the French would help Syria and Lebanon to obtain independence. The British would help the others. And this went on, throughout the world. But instead, like I said, while they were supposed to assist towards independence, the reality is really they were treated as colonial peoples. And this led to, you know, it did create international stability. In addition, the Middle East became a region that, that had a lot of interest because of the amount of oil, and is going to cause some tensions, especially in the period after 1945 with the creation of Israel. And the fact that a lot of these borders were just man-made or European-made, not made by the people within. And Iraq is a good example of that. You have a large percentage of Sunnis, Shiites, and as well as Kurds in the northern part, which have led to instability in that particular area. And despite these movements, independence was usually delayed until the mid and even late 20th century by the imperial powers reluctant to relinquish control. There was threats of interference from other nations. There was unstable economic political systems, as well as Cold War strategic alliance. So let's talk a little bit about it. And we're going to start with the Indian National Congress. Most of you have heard of Gandhi, and this developed in the late 19th century. And it was at the time that the British were trying to develop a native political elite that could assist in ruling such a huge country. But the exposure of these young Indians to Western ideas led to demands for independence. And Gandhi was the leading principle, and his idea of passive resistance and civil disobedience was real important. It was, in fact, it later on became the strategy used by Dr. Martin Luther King in the United States during the civil rights movements. The British wanted to be seen as civilized peoples, and so the idea of shooting at unarmed protesters was, something that they really preferred not to do if they could help it. And so we are going to see this go on. And India finally will gain independence after World War II. Like I said earlier, the British really weren't able to hold on. They couldn't afford to hold on to their colonies. And so in India, the Indian colony gained independence. We see the creation of India and Pakistan as the two states that come out of that former area. The French generally tended to handle independence movements a little bit differently than the British. The French really tried to hold on to some of their colonies. So after Japan left Indochina at the end of World War II, the French tried to reassert control. Indochina consists of the modern countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And in Vietnam, a man named Ho Chi Minh is going to lead the independence movement in the north. His group was called the Viet Minh. And Ho Chi Minh, although he was a communist, was probably more of a nationalist. He was hoping to achieve independence as well as set up a communist system that would work in Vietnam. And the French continued to fight for 8 years until the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, in which at that point the French withdrew. Vietnam was divided into a north that was communist and a pro-Western south, where we see a civil war and U.S. involvement. that continues until Vietnam achieves unification in 1975, free of Western influence and as a communist country. The other area that the French was Algeria. And this in particular was a difficult movement for the French because a bitter war broke out between France and the Algerian nationalists called the National Liberation Front. The problem with Algeria, what made it more difficult for the French to give it up, was that they had a large French population that considered Algeria an integral part of France. They didn't want the colony to become independent. And so, this war went on for a few years from the 1954 through 1962. And part of the end of this agreement, Charles de Gaulle was asked to come back to power as part of the movement to keep Algeria French. And he accepted the principle of Algerian self-determination. But in 1962, after more than a century of French rule, Algeria became independent. The European population quickly fled. And that crisis led to the end of the Fourth Republic and the beginning of the Fifth Republic as well. That is it for Key Concept 4. In our next review will be on Key Concept 4.2, and we'll talk about the Russian Revolution and other domestic issues that are going to go on in some of the countries, fascism, the Great Depression, and so forth. Until then.